Belila Kennedy, Belila Kennedy, yeah. Belila Kennedy, Bolingo e sala pasi, e koma lokola, Nzela e bongi puiso, Panama so bibo sombe. Timu, oyo denga obinaga, Timu, toka, oyo denga obinaga.
Greetings, greetings, greetings. Good evening and welcome to the National Theatre of Namibia's live webinar, where we will be unpacking issues concerning the development of Namibian theatre practices with a particular focus on the application and role of indigenous languages of Namibia. My name is Nela Shilongo. I am the Artistic Director at the National Theatre of Namibia. And I am very happy to welcome you all on our Zoom platform and on our YouTube channel at the National Theatre of Namibia for this live webinar this evening. Our webinar is titled The Critical Role of Indigenous Languages in Developing Namibian Theatre. This webinar is motivated by the current curatorial and programming processes currently at the theatre in reflection of the significant gap of the application of indigenous languages for artistic products and works that have been historically produced by the National Theatre of Namibia in the past plus minus 30 years. There is a very few, or there's a very little trace of artistic works and productions that have applied and incorporated indigenous languages of Namibia. And this is why we find ourselves in unpacking this conversation and really talking about the process in developing the kind of future that we want to see ourselves in as theatre makers, as writers, as performers, and also as consumers of Namibian theatre. So we will be unpacking on issues of development, on issues of consumption, and also the issues of the impact that we want to create and the various implications and processes thereof. We will be engaging, and we are joined by a wonderful expert panelist to discuss, along with our audience members that are joining us via Zoom and joining us via YouTube at National Theatre of Namibia. So we will be unpacking the critical role of indigenous languages and the processes and implications at hand, really touching on writing practices, touching on speech, touching on the consumption of theatre and the critical role that languages play, and not merely as a word, but really going beyond and understanding language as an institution. With that being said, I would like to introduce our wonderful panelists that are joining us this evening for this webinar. I'd like to start off with Professor Sarala Krishnamurthy, who has a PhD from Bangalore in India, and she is a professor of English in the Faculty of Human Sciences at the Namibia University of Science and Technology. She has taught at the postgraduate level for over 35 years in the areas of stylistics, English language teaching, and post-colonial literature. She has successfully supervised 8 PhD and 12 Masters of Philosophy students. Professor Krishnamurthy has published two books on African literature and several articles in international peer-reviewed journals. She has worked on 2 major national projects, projects. The first one is called the P3ICL project, which is to protect, preserve, and promote indigenous culture and languages with funding from the European Union. Secondly, another project is the Herero Genocide Survivor Narratives with funding from Carl Schluttwein Foundation in Switzerland. Professor Krishnamurthy has also served as part of the committee for the theatre judges in the Namibian Film and Theatre Awards since 2006. Professor, thank you very much for joining us. Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you, Nilako.
Next on our panel, we have Ms. Naisikire Izienda, who is an avid reader and loves all things concerning culture and heritage. She is the editorial and production manager at UNAM Press, which is the University of Namibia's dedicated publishing unit. She holds a bachelor degree in education, particularly in English and history from the University of Namibia. She also holds a postgraduate diploma in museum and heritage studies from the University of Western Cape, and also a certificate in managing cultural organizations from the University of Victoria in Canada, and also has a Master's of Art in English Studies from the University of Namibia. UNAM Press is dedicated to promoting and preserving indigenous languages through her work. Ms. Izienda has worked on several titles published in Namibian indigenous languages. Ms. Izienda, good evening, and thank you very much for joining us.
Good evening, and thank you for having me.
Thank you. Our next panelist is Dr. Niklas Fredericks, who is a senior lecturer in the Department of Communication at the Namibia University of Science and Technology. His research interests include social linguistics, that is in language attitudes, language shift, language death, and language revitalization. His interests further include Khoisan linguistics, particularly phonetics and phonology. In addition to that, he is also interested in communication and indigenous knowledge research from an anthropological perspective. He holds a PhD in linguistics from the University of the Western Cape. Thank you, Dr. Fredericks, for joining us, and good evening.
Good evening, Nila. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Doctor. Our last panelist for this evening is Ms. Florence Class, who is a passionate and caring woman and human rights defender, feminist community organizer, cultural activist, and creative writer. Her work focuses on the intersections between gender, mental health, and violence against women through feminist movement building, tech, and storytelling. She promotes indigenous creative writing by young women as a form of activism and healing. She has 10 years of experience in feminist moving building, community organizing, and youth leadership development. She is the executive director at YFem Namibia Trust, which is a feminist NGO that focuses on leadership development for girls and young women, gender diverse youth, advocacy, and movement support. She designs and executes projects for the advancement of women's rights, leadership, and empowerment of young girls and women. Ms. Florence Class, thank you so much for being with us this evening, and good evening.
Good evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you to our panelists for joining us this evening, and everyone that has joined us on our Zoom platform, and to everyone that has joined us on our YouTube channel at the National Theatre of Namibia. We'll get into our discussion, which is really about understanding language as an institution within this framework of really talking about the development of theatre practices in Namibia. And of course, when we're talking about theatre practices, we're talking about institutionalized theatre. We're talking about institutionalized artistic works and institutionalized artistic products. We do recognize that theatre, storytelling, and performance has continued to be practiced and expressed throughout in our cities, in our neighborhoods, in villages, in rural areas all around. So the context of this conversation is really about institutionalized theater with a particular focus on works that are produced by the National Theatre of Namibia and the gap that the National Theatre of Namibia has to play in really driving the development of performance and storytelling practices, and with a particular focus on the application and role of indigenous languages in that regard. So we'll get into the process and really talking about the complexities and the roles that are inherent in applying indigenous practices in Namibia. We'll talk about the standardizations when it comes to writing, because writing is a factor when it comes to really talking about the application and role of indigenous languages in performances, in storytelling, in theater making. We'll also touch on publishing processes, publishing implications, and also publishing policies that are currently at hand. And of course, as I said, standardizing writing practices as well. So with everyone that is joining us on Zoom, and everyone that is joining us on YouTube, please feel free to share your comments. As we have the discussions, please share your reflections. Excuse me. We will also have a Q&A session at the end of our discussion. But if there is any burning questions that is presented from our audience, we will also be sharing that in between. But please do save your questions and they will be, please do load them and they will be attended to at our main Q&A session during this webinar. So we will get into the discussion then. Our discussion this evening is framed into 4 themes. That is language as an institution, writing practices, artistic making, and also theater development on a macro level when we talk about the role and application of indigenous languages within our theater practices as well. So we'll get into it. And as I said, please do share your questions and comments throughout. I would like to start with Dr. Fredericks with the first question. Dr. Fredericks, it was great to really study and go through your PhD dissertation. And I was highly impressed, and this is why this first question was developed for you on the issue of language and conceptualization. Because often there are people that don't really understand understand language as an institution, its complexities and what it offers to us, and not merely understanding language as a way of communication on a, how can I say, on a superficial level. So I really want us to begin on this benchmark. And the question for Dr. Fredericks on the issue of language and conceptualization is indigenous storytelling through its various forms and features is used to communicate complex ideas, is used to communicate values and processes to help us understand ourselves better. The question to you, Dr. Fredericks, is what values are there around using our indigenous languages to conceptualize our daily lived experiences? Furthermore, what do indigenous languages offer us, and why is it critical to apply them as writers, as cultural workers, and as artists? Dr. Fredericks, please.
Well, thank you very much, Nelago, for the question, and good evening to viewers, everyone who is following us on all the platforms. To start with, what we need to understand is that it is well documented that most Namibians speak one of the indigenous languages as a first language. And it is through this language that the thought process actually takes place. So that is the start off point that we need to take into consideration, that we use one of the indigenous languages as a first language, and the thought process actually starts with this particular language. So one need to understand that it is through our indigenous languages that we practice our cultures. So that is the most important thing. You know, for us as Africans, without a language, we don't have culture. And this is often the mismatch whereby people don't take language as serious as they should be taking it. And the thought process that I've just alluded to needs to be taken into consideration, because in the mind, I mean, as a speaker of indigenous language, normally what happens is that we would actually think through this indigenous language before we actually use any other language even. So sometimes it happens that we use a language like English. In this case, I mean, I'm using English, but the thought process actually takes place in Kwekwe, which is my first language. So that's how the mind or the psycholinguistic aspect actually works. So if I take an example of a story someone narrates in their mother tongue, the moment it is translated, it loses meaning. So that's the importance of indigenous languages, even though we do not take it serious, I mean, out there. So it is that important. I hope I've responded to your question.
Certainly, Dr. Fredericks. It's very much appreciated that you highlight that mother tongues and our indigenous languages start with a thought process before anything can happen. And before text, we have the thought process. We have the conceptualization, how we understand, for example, love as people through our mother tongues, how we understand differences and difficulties and overcoming that, and how all these life experiences are conceptualized with our languages and our mother tongue. And it is enlightening that you do share that it's the thinking pattern that is the beginning of any engagement and communication, especially when we relate that to other audiences as well. Thank you, Dr. Fredericks. The next question is to Ms. Izienda, Ms. Naitsikire. Now that we have spoken about the thought patterns and the seed that actually, that languages and indigenous language, or just languages in general, enable us, with regards to the production of these thought processes and these thinking seeds as language, there seems to be quite a low production of particularly dramatic texts in Namibia, published in indigenous languages. There have been a few texts, very few texts of dramatic texts by the UNAM Press, a few others by Macmillan as an example. Can you perhaps take us into this phenomenon and why there seems to be a low publication of dramatic texts in indigenous Namibian languages, please?
I assume by dramatic texts that you're talking about, scripts, for example. And UNAM Press, I can't say too much on dramatic texts because we don't publish this type of work, not because we don't want to, but we don't receive many submissions of this type. I can say that working previously as editor at UNAM Press and working with submissions, over the past over the past 5 years, there's been growth in the submissions that we do receive in indigenous languages, although not as many compared to those in English, of course. Of the 33 publications that UNAM Press has published since its inception in 2012, only 6 of these are in local indigenous languages. If I can just ask Lavinia to put up the publications that we have covered, so I can say a little more about these. Of the 6 that have been published, two of the ones that are in Oshierero are both in Oshierero and in English. So it gives, it widens the readership slightly to more than just the Oshierero readers. We have Omiano, which is a book on proverbs and idioms in Oshierero, but they appear in English as well to widen the audience for this publication. Up next, this is Customary Law, Volume 2. We have Volume 3 as well. And these are the traditional laws that are set out by the traditional authorities. And these are written in the language of the community that is represented. We have Otudo, which is the next publication. which is a book written in 2017 by Dr. Hangara on the Ocherero Patrick clans. And what you find is that most of these Patrick clans were previously only passed down orally, and he's done his research amongst this community and gathered this information and put it in written form. He then subsequently, with two other authors, wrote a book, Odongombe, which is the next one that you'll see, which is on the cattle culture of the Kauko of Ahirero. Now, the two books that I mentioned, Otude and Odongombe, both the introductory material is in both English and Ocherero, and these books are extremely popular. The one on cattle culture, even all the way into Southern Africa, because, into South Africa, I mean, because, South African farmers farm with this Nguni cattle as well. The last publication that we have written in an indigenous language is Ohungi Peke, which is written completely in Oshindonga. Now, you can see that the number of publications in indigenous languages is really small compared to the books in English, for example. And the reason for this is because that there is a general reluctance from publishers to publish works in indigenous languages, because unfortunately, these works have a limited audience, limited readership, limited buying capacity by those who can read the language. And as a result, they just don't sell. The only indigenous language books that really do sell are textbooks. And these are limited to 1 or 2 books per grade over a period of 5 to 10 years, whenever the curriculum review takes place. And as far as we know, the Ministry of Education currently isn't prescribing additional reading material in indigenous languages. And this is where we need to see increased support for indigenous languages at this level. And the ministry needs to support publication in indigenous languages that can be used by the education sector. If indigenous languages are not supported in schools, there is really little incentive to write. And as a result, little incentive to publish, because then there is nothing. Now at UNAM Press, our policy specifies that we support and preserve indigenous languages and culture. So we take the publication risk to support and promote indigenous languages. And we do this amidst high production costs and poor distribution channels. And the distribution channels I refer to here are getting these materials into the more remote rural areas where you have the majority of readership for the material that is published in indigenous languages.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Yenda, for that. For raising that there seems to be a reluctance on the producers of the texts. And I think that's a reflection on writers. And if there is a writer that has joined us on the within our audiences, perhaps on Zoom or YouTube, perhaps then if you can just share your reflections on this remark on the issue of reluctance, and we will actually get into the issue of the standardizing of writing and the various concerns and issues around that as well. Before we get to Professor Krishnamurthy, we will continue on this trail of language as an institution, starting as a seed, and the issues of transferring that into text, and just what Mrs. Yenta raised on the reluctance of perhaps some writers and artistic makers. Ms. Florence Class, I would like to talk to you about the appetite of young people, particularly that you have worked with, in applying indigenous languages in their poetry and in their journals and storytelling as well. If we can just touch on this issue of appetite, are young people open to it? Are they reluctant to it? And please just share your work processes with young people in this regard, especially young women, and what kind of appetite or values it had instilled in these young people with your motivation and encouragement of applying indigenous languages in their writing.
Thank you so much. That is a very interesting and a very important question that you have asked me. It is a matter of urgency. It is a matter of urgency that we disrupt, the systems that have been placed for us to be able to speak out for ourselves and really to also speak out from where we are coming from. So when I start these processes of young people, especially with young women, I ask the question of what does the concept of home mean to us as a collective? What is home? And when we are speaking about home, we are speaking about where we are coming from. We are speaking about the truest person that we are internally. And so before we can even communicate with the world, we need to be able to communicate with ourselves. So it starts with the process of being able to communicate with oneself. So being able to affirm oneself, being able to celebrate yourself, knowing where you are.
I think we are losing Ms. Class for a little while. I think while she is joining us back, if she can just be muted, I would like to jump over to Professor Krishna Murthy. You have been part of the judging committee since 2006. That is the Namibian Theatre and Film Awards. Just before we get back to Ms. Florence. Professor, since 2016, you have an overview in terms of the performance qualities that NTN has produced in terms of artistic works, as well as scripts in your work as a theatre judge. In your view, what are the gaps and opportunities of indigenous languages in shaping Namibian institutionalized theatre with regard to just having your experience since 2016 in experiencing all these productions and just having all your various reflections on them as well?
Thank you for the question, Alao. You keep saying 2016, but it's 2006. So
sorry.
let me just I think that 2016 is stuck in your head somehow. But anyway, what I would like to say is, yes, I've been a judge for a very, very long time. And I'm very passionate about theatre. I'm very interested in drama. When I was young, I used to be an actor and director myself, but that was many lifetimes ago. At least here in Namibia, I've had the opportunity to witness a lot of productions and also to give my inputs about into theatre. I also served on the board of NTN, so I interacted with a lot of drama practitioners. I would like to first of all say, I think in the last 15 years, there has been a tremendous improvement in the kind of quality of productions, in the kind of plays that are being produced, both original and adaptations. Adaptations, beautifully adapted, beautifully enacted, fantastic. But I'm more interested in original plays because I think we need to have Namibian plays and we need to tell Namibian stories. And I would say that Namibian stories are being told, though there are not too many. I think there is an improvement in terms of the quality of the production, in terms of what is being shown on stage. And I'm very happy about the fact that quite a number of people have started coming to the theatre, to NTN, to watch plays. They'd rather come and watch plays than watch television or watch Netflix. So for me, that is an improvement. I remember in those days when we used to have plays, there would be just about 10 or 20 people in the audience. I remember the very first play that we produced at NAST, and it was one of Wole Soyinka's plays, and there were only 20 people in the audience watching that play. But now at least you have an audience, you have the play running for 3 days, and there will be at least 100 to 200 people watching. So for me, I think that's a great improvement. But I would like to talk about the gap. I think the biggest gap is the use of indigenous languages for plays. I think in all my years of watching plays at NTN, it was only, I can count on my fingertips. John Fangeos was done, partly done in Oshikwanyama. Then I was thinking, of course, you have the Afrikaans plays, but I'm thinking there was, I'm not able to remember exactly the year, but 2008 or 2009, there was there was a competition which Werner Taniseb organized for plays from the regions which were done in the original languages. And there were some brilliant productions, and all these plays were not at NTN, but they were in one of the schools at in Comas. I think it's in Comas or in Katatura. And those plays were brilliant. And even though I couldn't understand, what for me was very enchanting was, the kind of vibrancy and the kind of local culture and the ritualistic aspect of the local culture that stood out. So I always believe that we have a lot of stories to tell. Namibians have a lot of stories. We have a lot of stories, and we have to tell our stories. And why, we keep talking, we keep complaining that our students don't read, our children don't read literature. But why aren't we telling Namibian stories in Namibian languages? Because then they will read, and we need to instill in them this love for literature, love for reading when they're 2, 3, 4 years old. And that will happen only if they read stories in their own languages. And so for me, it's a gap. But of course, that is an amazing opportunity. And so therefore, for me, I think the whole wide world is open for us. If I can just take a couple of minutes more, I worked, I think Nelao mentioned the fact that we worked on this project, which is called the P3ICL, and I got funding for that. And that's to protect, preserve, and promote indigenous culture and languages. And what we did is we identified 3 endangered languages. And these languages are the Oludemba language, the Kung, I'm sorry, I'm not able to do the click, and I'm scared to try the click and do it wrong. So please forgive me for that. And of course, the Shifwe. And what we did with those plays, but maybe I can talk about this a little later, but we collected a lot of stories, and those are all now published. They're all available, but I will talk about that a little later as we go on.
Thank you. Thank you, Prof. It's really great that you brought up the issue of the competition with Netflix and, other cables and even other lifestyles and lifestyle activities that theatre is in competition with. And that is definitely other variables that challenge the development of theatre practices in Namibia. And going back to the vibrancy that you're talking about, that vibrancy is also dependent on the artistic makers of our stories, of our texts. And I'd like to go back to Ms. Florence Class on the issue of, or your experience rather, of working with young people, because obviously what's being brought now is this issue of appetite with the makers of these stories, the makers of these works. Briefly, please, if you could share your experience in working with young people and how you had instilled or motivated the application of indigenous language for their poetry, for their storytelling, and what kind of shift, if any, this has created in them, please.
Okay, thank you. So something really interesting that I can maybe share is we've recently with YFM working with indigenous adolescent girls and young women to see how they can use storytelling to tell the stories of how harmful cultural practices are impacting their lives. So we would have creative writing workshops with these young women to ask them, what does healing mean to them? And in those conversations where we are talking about what does, this respect for elders mean, a lot of things really came up for us when we're having those conversations with young women, because young women would speak out about how, they are being silenced because they have to be respectful towards their parents. And in that silence, there's this violence that is continuously breeding because they are not able to communicate and they are not able to speak up for themselves. So creating those essential safe spaces with young people whereby we are reflecting on the lives that we are living, and we are actually learning to reflect and to write. Writing is a very important form of documenting not only our lived realities, but it's also a platform for us to reflect on the lives that we are living. So through our workshops, we are continuously telling young women, to use journal writing as a tool of feminist resistance. If we document our lived realities, if we document how our days are unfolding, we are shaping and reshaping our stories. So through those our community engagements, creating those safe spaces with young people, we are inspiring them to dig deeper within themselves, for us to heal as a collective and as individuals, but mostly for us to breathe, to pause, and to just write freely about how we feel and about how, the world that we see. And we actually empower young women and promote that they speak in their indigenous language, that they learn to write within their indigenous languages. And one of the most powerful things that we have encountered through doing that is that.
Okay, I think we are losing Ms. Trajas again. She will be muted, and she will be given an opportunity to just close her session. But thank you once again for everyone that has joined us on Zoom and on YouTube. Please do load your comments and your questions. We will have a Q&A session. We've just picked up the conversation touching on understanding language as an institution, which Dr. Fredericks did touch on, and Ms. Naitikire Izienda also touched on the implications on why Namibia has seen for the past years a low production of publications in indigenous works. Of course, this is a very big discussion, but a few points that were brought about were perhaps there is a reluctance from the artistic makers, and obviously there are issues if we are to talk about the kind of economy that we're in. The consumption of indigenous texts is not as high as other texts would be in terms of that attraction to those texts. So I think just part of the theme that we're sitting with is the issue of globalization, and also providing alternative themes and consuming stories, consuming experiences that are alternative to what globalization has offered us, and perhaps even remnants of colonialization. So thank you very much to our panelists for just kickstarting the conversation. Writing practices, of course, is is another theme that comes along with unpacking issues of the role of indigenous languages in developing storytelling and developing theater practices. And I'd like to throw this first and foremost to Dr. Fredericks and Professor Krishnamurthy afterwards on the issues of writing, especially when artists are not proficient in their mother tongues, but they still have the deep passion to produce these stories. To just start with Dr. Fredericks, please. As a scholar, as a linguist, can you please share, if possible, if an artist is not equipped in writing, in standardized writing in their mother tongue, but they're very interested and passionate about transforming these stories and these experiences in our indigenous languages onto stage, what kind of collaborative processes can take place between artists and cultural researchers and linguists and so forth? And what kind of processes would be inherent or involved in this regard? Please, Dr. Fredericks, if you can share.
Thank you very much, Nelago, again, for asking this very important and pertinent question. So the writing system of a language should be simplified, so that has to be the start off point. Normally, in the past, because of the colonial background and, with most of the orthographies that we have got, it was extremely difficult. Like, for example, if I take the example of Kwekukova, for example, we are using some symbols, that were introduced by Lipsius, in years, long back. So, and for these symbols, it is extremely difficult to even use them on a computer, for example. So it's a scary process. It's not straightforward. So it is known fact that artists and writers may collaborate, especially when the artist has the ability to speak a language. So when the artist has got the ability to speak a language, it's much more easier. If you can find translators who can translate for these particular artists and so on. So collaborative work can definitely take place. But this is a challenge facing many speakers of Kwekukova, for example, whereby they can actually speak the language, but they can't write it. So the good thing is that it is not something new. We are faced with this challenge whereby we have got speakers actually majority of them who can speak the language, but they can't write it. So it is definitely a challenge. So this could be tackled by adopting a harmonized orthography. So, I would take you to the issue around orthographies. People also underestimate a good orthography, or having, to have a sound orthography, which is harmonized, that takes into account a number of languages, for example, and not only one language. So orthography, I've realized in Namibia, is quite prescriptive, and where some languages are actually shut out, and so on. But if you have a harmonized orthography whereby you include a number of languages, for example, that would definitely work. But what needs to be considered is the involvement of a number of stakeholders like the teachers, linguists, and communities to assist with the development of orthographies. So in the past, orthographies would develop whereby the locals were not involved, or maybe, linguists are there, but teachers are not present, and so on. So we would normally, then we would end up with a problem of ownership, whereby people do not own the orthography. So that is the issue here. So if the speakers or those who are involved, that's why I've talked about the stakeholders. So you need to have a number of them who need to be involved. That way, they would own the process. So as soon as the orthography is ready, the material needs to be developed, like the word list, dictionaries, and so on. So once you have got the word list and dictionaries, writers can actually benefit. Everybody can actually benefit from this kind of a process. And this would
Dr. Fredericks.
Yes.
Let me cut you there. Thank you so much. Because I actually want to jump to Professor Krishna Murthy. Thank you, Dr. Fredericks, for bringing about that very complex collaborative process that should be happening between artists and cultural researchers and linguists as well. Thank you for the comment about the stakeholders. And I think even as understanding NTN as a stakeholder, NTN henceforth also thinking about its role in enabling these processes as well, because it can be quite challenging to combine the various departments and the various professionals together into these spaces. I want to carry over to Professor Krishna Murthy with regards to the role of the artists themselves and the research process that is also required, never on top of collaborating with other professionals as well. The question is, what research approaches, Professor, would you suggest for storytellers in pursuing the understanding of indigenous knowledge systems amid global and urban implications that create distances with these systems? What collaborative research process can artists pursue, especially when they're interrupted with their base, if they're in the city, whereas the indigenous knowledge system, the raw one or the first-hand one, if I can say, is sometimes far-fetched or very far away? Please, Professor.
Yes. Thank you, Nilau. I think Dr. Fredericks raised a very important point when he talked about orthography. Orthography is very important for people to develop, and if you don't have the orthography, there is no opportunity to write. I think when we talk about collaboration, and you also have highlighted this particular point, that researchers are in the cities and they are in academic institutions and they're working in academic institutions. How do they collaborate with storytellers? I think it is very important for researchers to go back into the communities. And if you are able to go into a community where you already know the language, then that is a great advantage. And there you collaborate with the storytellers. Let me tell you a little bit about we did with our P3ICL project, and I'll just give the example of Oludemba language. We went to Opuo, and then we discovered that there was this Oludemba people, and then we decided to go to Ruakana. We met them, we got their permission, we met the elders, we spoke to them about the project, and then we started using Oludemba's data collectors. So these were students from UNAM, from NUST, who were in the regions, and they took us to the villages. We went deep into the villages and we collected stories. So those stories were collected by the students. So in one way, what we were doing is we were training the students to collect data. And once those stories were collected. What we did is we asked, it was a very interesting, I'm going to connect it to theater because that's important for me. What we did was we talked to the Oludemba people and we said, which is the ritual that you think is the most beautiful and which you would like to present to the world, to the global community? And it was fantastic because there were nearly 80 people and we divided them into 4 focus groups, and we had a focus group discussions, and finally they came up with the Etanda Onyondo ceremony, which is the male circumcision ceremony. And we recorded all the rituals in the Oludemba language. We brought it back to NUST, and I contacted, I think this is where I feel so sorry and sad about David Javera. We contacted David Javera, and he was the one who actually, because Oludemba language is quite close to Oshihirero, so he dramatized the Etanda Onyondo ceremony and wrote this whole play, and it was projected, it was enacted at NUST, and with the students all watching the play. And then what we did, we recorded the whole thing in a video format, and we took it back to the community to show it to them. And you will not believe it. I think we showed that video first time. Can you imagine an Oludemba play being shown in Ruakana villages, to the people there? And there were people who walked 30-40 kilometers to come and watch the play. At the end of the day, there were nearly 120 people who had come from the different parts of Ruakana to watch the play. And what was very fascinating for me was the people engaged with the play. They said, no, this ritual is not being done properly. And, it was a critical engagement. And this is the mistake we make. We think, we are academics and the written form is very important. And, we talk about Elizabethan theater, the Aristotelian theater, blah, 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 all that, Sophoclean theater. But the critical engagement is happening there in the village with the village people who don't have any idea about theater. It was beautiful. And I think this is what we need to focus on. I'm going to stop with 1 minute. We need to flip this and make oral literature important for us. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Prof. And thank you to everyone that is submitting their comments and their questions. Before we move to Ms. Florence and also Naitikile, because many people are also bringing up the issue of intellectual property. Obviously, there's sensitivities around the collaborative research processes, sensitivities around collaborating with quote unquote indigenous members of community and kind of extracting information out of that. But before we get into that, please, Professor, there's just a question from Ms. Lalu Mokuku. I hope I'm pronouncing your surname right. She is asking, with regards to the collaborative research that you did with students, she's asking, what do you mean you used students, Prof? If please briefly you can just share with us.
I really don't get, yeah, I unmuted myself. I don't get the question. I used students. We trained them to collect data. The students recorded the stories in the original language, spoke to the people, got the stories from them, recorded the stories, and then they transcribed the stories in the original language and then translated the stories into English. And I have now, 6 books, and I'm just showing one. I have 6 books. I've got collections of stories which are in the original language and translated into English. And I have the play, and this is the Etanda Onyondo play, which is in the original language, and it has been translated into English.
Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you for that feedback, and I hope the question was answered as well. And we will get back into the IP and copyright issues as well, because it's definitely is sensitive. I'd just like to read a few comments from our participants on the webinar. There is a comment from Kingo Mchobu, who says, very interesting panel discussion. The broad issue of mother tongue, for example, is used in schools. The willingness of people to speak and engage in the mother tongue is important. The deep indigenous knowledge embedded in culture, etc., will all be lost unless we make an effort to recognize that mother tongue is a resource. I think that's a very good comment, especially for our storytellers and artists. There is another comment from Dr. Lorenda Olivier Samson. This is on the issue of consumption and the appetite for the kind of languages and kind of stories we want to consume. Dr. Lorenda Olivier Samson says there is more indigenous language theater work going on than is reflected in the published canon. Writers face difficulties in getting their creative work published, and in a multilingual society, theater makers opt for a language that most of the audiences can understand. Thank you for that comment, Doctor. And I think this is what we're also trying to sit with at the National Theatre of Namibia, really trying to tackle this issue of appetite and the kind of appetite that we want to draw and stimulate for audiences, and in a few years really getting to a point where we have a high following and a high appreciation of theatre works and stories in our indigenous languages that the wider public community can enjoy and consume as well. There is another comment by Sonio Kalimbo that is saying that it's an interesting topic, indeed very insightful and educative. Thank you very much. Please do keep the comments coming and also the questions. We will have a Q&A session. Before I get to Ms. Naitikile Izienda, I'd like to go back to Ms. Florence Class, just this issue of the development of storytelling and the development of performance works, and also coming from our traditions as Africans with oral tradition, and now in contemporary times, obviously we are pressed with writing and transforming and then archiving that as well. You are a storyteller yourself, and I would very much like to ask, and I'm sure this will be beneficial to our participants, on your process, on your research process when it comes to oral tradition. And the question reads, our oral tradition is quite accessible, especially for artists that do not have writing proficiencies in their mother tongue. In what ways would you encourage storytellers to tap into our oral traditions and indigenous knowledge system, particularly in the areas of research and performance development, just trailing from what we are coming from? Please, Ms. Class.
Thank you. So one practical example that we can use is music. It's sound. When it comes to indigenous language preservation, music is the one thing that is still very prominent within our communities. Even the small children that we see in the streets, you know, they would be singing to songs that are written within their indigenous language, and that is very powerful. So we need to learn something from the musical industry and how it is preserving our language. So in terms of my creative process of using my mother tongue, which is Kweko Kovap, and incorporating it into my creative process of writing, I've made a decision very young in my life that in anything that I write, I need.
I think we are losing her again. She'll be muted, and then we'll wait for her to come back, and we will definitely come back to this question. We'll move over to Ms. Naitikile Izienda. I have two questions for you. Ms. Florence, we will get back to you. Ms. Naitikile, on the issue of transcribing or transforming our indigenous knowledge and our indigenous value systems onto paper and onto text, especially that it was brought about with this issue of collaborative research processes. In terms of publishing, what are the policies and issues around intellectual property and copyright when it comes to publishing text and producing these texts from one's indigenous knowledge system or community or backdrop? What does this mean for ownership in terms of the transference into the published text or published format with regards to the maker or the writer and also the community that it comes from, please?
Thank you, Nirago. You know, intellectual property is such a complex topic. So I'm not an expert on intellectual property, so I will keep my answer brief. What I can say is that often when we copyright is limited to original works of authorship, but these are works that are, fixed in a tangible medium of expression. This means that one can tell a story around a fire, but it's only when that story is recorded or written down do issues of copyright come into play. And it's been in the past that the individual who records or writes the story is the one who holds the copyright and not necessarily the storyteller. Of course, more and more, there's issues around morals and ethics, and this is changing that, individuals and researchers, academics are becoming more responsible, and they're bestowing this copyright, rightfully so, to the originators, to the storytellers, of the communities. Intellectual property, it's based on this notion that ideas and innovations expressed through these various material forms, whether it's text or song or dance or poetry, that it can be owned, and that individuals can, have distinct property rights over these forms of creative expression. And this is so correct from a Western sort of perspective, but we must, with our local communities, knowledge that was passed down from one generation to the next was not owned by one individual. Elders had a duty to pass this knowledge down. So it's a bit problematic when it comes to dealing with issues of intellectual property, because there are issues around contestation, especially with when it comes to talking about who is the originator of the work, who owns this piece of work. Is it me as a researcher who goes in and does the research and records and brings this information up into the public domain? Or is it, the elder that has told the story and has held onto this knowledge for many, many years? I can give an example that we're currently dealing with at UNAM Press. We've recently been asked to republish a manuscript on Oshuambo folktales. And we at first instant, we're so interested and so happy that we received this, because this is knowledge that needs to be out there in the community, that needs to be given to young kids to grow up and pass down from generation to generation. Now, the problem that we have is trying to find out who owns ownership, who has the copyright of these works. Is it the original publisher who published this work? Is it the authors who put together this volume of folktales? Or is the work so old and so it's been in the communities for so long that it's now in the public domain? And as an academic publisher, we obviously have, we prescribe to certain policies and regulations that keep us in check. And if we go ahead and publish this without the rights or permissions, you may find that after publishing, an individual or an author comes and says, hang on, this is my work, and now you owe me royalties. So it's very, very challenging. And just to sum up, intellectual property with regards to indigenous languages can really be problematic, and it requires investigating, and it really does require taking it on case by case when dealing with publications in indigenous languages. When as an academic publisher, we do require that an author, when they approach us to publish a work in indigenous language, that they hold the copyright, or at least have sought permission from the copyright holders before we can go ahead and publish.
Thank you, Ms. Naitikere. And I think what is also coming up for at least the theatre side is a space where we can enable this understanding, because it is quite sensitive. I'm sure with the project that Prof is working on, Prof Krishnamurthy, on indigenous preservation and protection, this issue of ownership and protection of the community, of these systems and knowledges that these communities, where they come from, is very, very sensitive. So I think moving forward, the theatre would definitely have to enable some kind of engagement, so that at least the mediums who are the artists are mediums in which we get to experience ourselves, in which we get to remember where we come from as a people, can at least research and do and make these experiences and stories in the most respectful and protective manner. Before we just wrap up our conversation, because we will be going into our Q&A, and before I go back to the other panelists, I will come back to Ms. Florence Class. Please, if you can just bounce back on your process as storyteller and drawing from oral traditions, if you can briefly tell us about that process. And I would also like to extend on the issue of how indigenous languages allow us to mobilize various issues through theater, mobilize issues about women, mobilize issues about our contemporary issues and problems, and that's how the consumption of theater also grows, because these issues become packed into stories and these artistic projects. But first of all, please, if you can tell us about your processes with regards to storytelling and drawing that research process from your oral traditions, briefly, please.
Thank you. So one of my process is really to look at the urban plus the rural setting. There's totally two different kind of a setting, and we have to address the issue of access to information, to have access to different kinds of platforms. So working with communities that are living in rural communities is a totally different kind of area of work that we need to unpack and that we need to learn from and that we need to collaborate from. Because people within the rural communities are very, they hold to their language and to their tradition is still very much vibrant and very much strong, and it can be an inspiration to all of us. So that is where I get my inspiration from. I get my inspirations from the mountains, from the wind that blows, from our community and the way we speak our language, the way we express ourselves, the way we dream. So all of those things are things that are coming together in the creative process of saying, how are we narrating the stories of our community, of how we live, how we eat together, how we dream as a collective? How do we bring that out together in a way that we express ourselves through creative expression and through writing? So another thing is young people, especially young women, are the ones that are creating languages. So we need to really tap into promoting and supporting the youth, because they are the ones that are the creators of new languages. They're the ones that are upholding, they're the ones that can make things really viral. So if we could promote young people to not be restricted to,
I think we are losing her again, but no worries. We will come back to her if she can be muted, please. Thank you once again for all the comments. I'm just going to read a few before we wrap up our discussion and move over to our Q&A. We will come back to Ms. Florence, certainly. This is a comment from Sarafina France. She says, I agree that there's a need to do more collection of traditional stories in Namibia. The elderly have this treasure in their hearts. These stories need to be recorded from different communities, targeting the old because they are getting old and may vacate the planet anytime soon. All tradition contributes to moral values. Thank you, Ms. Sarafina France, for that comment. And I think I'm going to bounce this back at a much later stage to Dr. Fredericks on the issues of archives. What kind of available archives do we have? Apart from living archives, what material archives do we have nationally and internationally as well, especially with regards to colonial archives that artists can also draw from, and they're very, very rich. Another comment is from Herbert Vantana. It says the researcher should share the profit with the cultural groups. And this is why I'm authoring books on understanding IP. Thank you for that comment. And definitely the discussion about IP is very dense. It's very serious. And we will definitely be unpacking this at another point and at another platform. I would definitely want to engage Professor Krishnamurthy, particularly with this issue as well, and Ms. Naisikire Izienda on this issue of ownership, intellectual property, and as such. There is Another comment, it says, very well observed, Nela Shilongo. It has been noted that some artists are very good on stage, but could not present their artistic talents on paper. In fact, like previously said, these are current challenges that we face today. But the question remains, what should be done instead of exceptionally recording and maybe reviewing and presenting the performed artistic works in black and white should be done to preserve these type of works? Apart from translating, as it was observed, that one could not 100% translate a native language into English, for instance, the language quality or meaning will obviously be slightly changed. Thank you for that comment and for that question, Sonyo Kalimbo. We are going to begin to wrap up our conversation, and then we will be heading into our Q&A shortly. Dr. Nicholas Fredericks, I'm going to come back to you, especially for you to please assist us in departing this conversation on the issue of archive. Please, could you share with us maybe just your reflections with everything that has been bouncing in the room, issues of collaborative making, issues of challenges of being an artist but not necessarily having the skills to write proficiently in their mother tongue, and also the available resources that artists can draw from in terms of archives. What material archives do we have accessible nationally and internationally, especially with regards to colonial archives, because those are quite rich in terms of the colonialists and travelers that have recorded these conversations, songs, stories that are very valuable for us as contemporary people today. Please, Dr. Fredericks, briefly.
Oh, thank you very much, Nilago. With regard to the archives, we have got the National Archive here in Namibia, for example, and what we can also, access are the university archives, in Namibia, and I've realized that all over the world, we have got indigenous archives in various countries, so that can be accessed. If you are interested, if you're looking for information in a particular country, then you can go to that particular country, and then with their national archives are listed all over. So, and then also from the university side. So I've seen higher institutions all over, have got archives. I remember at UCT, for example, for indigenous languages, they have got an archive, and this one is connected to Europe in one way or the other. I know at some stage, we had issues around it, whereby, the feeling is that if an archive is based in Namibia, we would want our, whatever material to remain in Namibia. But now, if the archive is based in a foreign country, then it becomes a problem also. And that has been the case for most African countries, whereby we have got archives in our names, but it is actually hosted, it is based in some other foreign country. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fredericks, for that. I think at this stage, as you say, they're accessible. Some are accessible openly and some are accessible on request. And it's a very complex process, this one, especially with the colonial history that these archives have. So I think moving forward is also to have a list accessible for artists, especially when we're talking about research and drawing from these harsh and violent ways that have been drawn from our communities, but are anyway useful, especially with what we can do with them today in terms of that continuation. I'd like to then also start to depart with Ms. Naitikile before we go into Q&A, and also with other panelists. Ms. Naitikile Izienda, is publishing as a writer in theater, as a writer in storytelling, is publishing the only option, especially within the professional publishing environment? If not, what alternative opportunities are there to producing and exporting indigenous text as artists, alternative to professional publishers and collaborating with them and partnering with them? What alternative perhaps options are there in exporting and ensuring that Namibian stories and Namibian voices are heard, alternative to publishers? I'm sorry to ask it this way, but It is a question that many have.
You know, I might need assistance from my fellow panelists or from the audience, because I'm not sure what other opportunities are available to getting our indigenous language texts out there. I mean, one has to ask, is there a global appeal for our local languages? Is there an appetite for our local languages beyond our borders, and not just, you know, in Southern Africa, for example? I mean, I would think that any sort of overseas publication for a wide market would have to be in English, with indigenous terms and maybe expressions of for local flavor. But I don't know what opportunities there are for our texts globally. I mean, at the moment, the books that we publish in local indigenous languages are distributed, well, they're on the distribution list of our international distributor. But unfortunately, you need access to the language in order to consume, you know, the work, in order to read the work. And unless you have Namibian roots, that publication isn't really going to appeal to you.
Thank you, Ms. Naitikile Zenda. It's a very tough circumstance in that regard, is that you have brought out, and I think yes, and I think it's something to ponder on, because either way, as Namibian storytellers, as Namibian artists, as Namibian researchers, we need to export. We need to consume our work locally, and we need to export it if we want to talk about expanding Namibian theatre culturally and commercially as well. So this is an elephant in the room that I think we need to fight with still in further platforms. Before we head to Ms. Trahas, Professor Krishnamurthy, I would like to also start to depart with you into our Q&A. Please, if you have any reflections on any points that were brought about, and furthermore, especially with your work in editing the books that you have you know, gone to publish with, you know, the likes of UNAM Press and everything, your research on Namibian literature, apart from our indigenous knowledge systems, apart from oral tradition, do you think it is viable to apply already produced literature, such as Namibian fiction literature, onto Namibian stages by applying indigenous languages? Is that a viable option, and you see that as sustainable, especially sustaining the relationship between storytellers and writers in Namibia? Sorry, Prof, you are on mute.
Thank you for the question, Ella. I was thinking about this, you know, and I look back on the plays that have been staged at NTN, and I remember two plays. One was an adaptation of Things Fall Apart, where Lucky Peters again played the role of Okonkwo, and then of course of Mice and Men, which is again played by Lucky Peters. So adaptations are possible. And I'm amazed by the fact, you know, I chair a literature committee, and this literature committee is looking at how do we increase or improve interest in literature, both in English and in indigenous languages. And one of the things that we talked about is how do we, the first thing that we wanted to do is we wanted to see how much of Namibian literature there is. And somehow we seem to think there's no Namibian literature, but I was very surprised to see that I have got 50 books, Namibian literature. I've got poetry, I've got fiction, I've got autobiographies, and I've also got plays. So it's not that we don't have, there is a lot of Namibian literature, and a lot of people are writing, a lot of people are now publishing. And I'm also amazed by the fact that, you know, the one form that most people are scared of, that's poetry, and poetry is the one that is published most. I just finished reviewing one anthology of poetry by Prince, and it's brilliant. We have got so much of literature. Yes, We can make use of fiction and we can adapt fiction for the stage. I don't think there's a problem. But I think we can have original plays also. We can have original plays because we have original rituals. Why are we not using the rituals, the stories that we have in our indigenous cultures, and why aren't we dramatizing them? I think this is where the researchers, the scholars, the storytellers have to go back to the community, talk to the community, look at what they're doing in the community, and do the play there itself for the community, because that is how you engage the people. And it's, I can talk about Gugiwa Kiongo, who switched from English to Gikuyu, and he went back to the community and they wrote a play together called I Will Marry When I Want. Of course, it was translated later into English. And this is a play that was done by the community itself. And, you know, the communities are very vibrant. They've got this wealth of culture and song and dance and performance. They have everything. Why are we not tapping into that? I think that's what we need to do. But let me, before I stop, just one last point, because I want to pick up on what Dr. Frederick said about archiving. These books which I have published, I'm not selling them. I'm not making any money. All the books will be going back into the libraries. They will be going to the schools, and they will be going back to the communities. So the communities will have the books in the school library, schools, for the students to read. So as a researcher, I would like to just place this on record that I'm not interested in making money out of this. This is a European Union funded project in which I collected the books, and they're all there. And of course, they'll be there in the National Library, they'll be there in the NUS Library, they'll be there in the UNAM Library. And we also have at NUS Library, we have a Namibian section, which has got all the material that we have collected from the project, which will be available on open access for researchers, for people, for public who are interested from all over the world. So everybody, anybody who wants, and I think that's the way to go. I think the mistake that we make is, I hear what Natsi was saying, you know, that it's difficult to publish these books because not too many people are willing to buy them. And why would somebody in the US or in Germany be interested in reading an Oludemba play because they don't know the language? But I think we're thinking about this the wrong way. Let us preserve, let us collect, and let us protect and promote our cultures within our country first. If our children, our people are able to read these in their languages, these languages will grow, they will not die out. And that is what we need to do. Maybe today I have only 4,000 Kung speakers, but maybe after 20 years, there will be a scholar who will come from that community who will want to take this up further. And where will he go looking for material? All those materials will be in the archives, which will be there in the library. These days, with the kind of facility we have, you can take a smartphone and you can record. So it is easy to do it. We need to encourage our people proud of their language and culture. We need to encourage them to record and send. Maybe we should start an archive and say, okay, collect a story and send it to us. And we built, maybe NTN could take that, and you start collecting an archive and collecting all the stories. It can be done.
Thank you so much, Prof. Krishnamurthy, for that. Very powerful. They will now head to Ms. Florence Class before we head into our Q&A session, a very short Q&A session. Ms. Class, please, if you can, because we've been losing each other, sorry about that, with regards to internet, just wrapping up from, or bouncing from your artistic processes, bouncing from the appetite and the appetite that needs to be instilled within us artists, you know, never mind just young people, but within artists, what drive or what processes should we enable within ourselves. And lastly, please, we have spoken about briefly about oral tradition. We've spoken about drawing from indigenous knowledge systems. We have explored the viability of adapting already produced Namibian fiction literature. Can we, with you, expand on developing theater by using content such as empowerment, such as mobilization, especially those contemporary issues that we're also experiencing today, be it poverty, be it stigmatization, be it hate, hate and intolerance with our various community members. You work as a feminist with young people, you work with gender diverse young people and gender diverse people, especially with regards to storytelling. How can we expand on those issues in expanding the consumption of theater practices, never mind for a little while the oral traditions or where we're coming from, but having theater grow and having us consume theater by really talking about issues about leadership, everyday life experiences, and across various people as well. This is a mouthful, but I hope it is understood, especially drawing from your work.
Thank you. It is really important that communities take ownership of their language. And it is something that we need to do collectively, and that process involves collaborations. We want to see civil society organizations more involved in terms of cultural development and preserving of languages. What is the role of our media as well, as we are writing about, cultural leadership and activism? How can the academia play a role in terms of breaking the barrier and connecting more often with civil society organizations such as NGOs, and also with local communities, and also building that connection with traditional authorities, as they are the ones that are, the gatekeepers when it comes to our tradition and our culture. Using the media, for example, such as the traditional media, such as radio. In the past days, we would sit around the fire listening to radio programs that were in indigenous language. It was the most powerful and the most beautiful way of us expressing ourselves. And I think it is important that we continue doing that, and that we continue promoting our languages so that people can, wherever they are, not restricted by the way they can articulate themselves in their indigenous language, but for them to just take that leap of faith and to produce and do a lot of content creation, especially for young people as well. We are in the era of social media, and we want to see more young people creating content when it comes to indigenous languages. So it is a challenge, but it is also a great opportunity for us to really put our work out there, because if we do not, and if we are thinking we are continuously being restricted, then we are falling behind as Namibia, and that is something that we do not want as a collective. So we need to continuously promote writing, promote performances, especially by our youth that are living in rural communities and also in urban settings. And we need to start by the young ones. We need to start by pre-primary schools. When is the time for us to create content for the young people, so that we are also building their literacy from a very young age? Because young children think it is very more glamorous to be expressing themselves into English rather than their mother tongue. And there's this misconception from parents that children need to learn English as a first language and not their mother languages, which is also very violent in itself, because we are losing not only ourselves, our identity, but it's our roots of our expression and our communications. So in terms of us, breaking through from those worlds of, westernized ways of us communicating, we have to reclaim our power. And into doing that, I want to talk a little bit about, feminist leadership and knowledge production and knowledge creation when it comes from a Namibian point of view. A lot of content that has been created in terms of women's rights, it is coming from a Western part of the world. We do not know how, as African women, as African communities, we are overcoming different kinds of struggles. And for us to be able to be the knowledge producers, to say that these are some of the challenges that we have encountered as Africa. We are talking about the economy, we are talking about patriarchy, we are talking about, economic justice, issues that we are facing each and every day, even with this COVID-19, we need to be at the forefront of creating our languages and to be radical in that sense that we do not need to be restricted in a way that of how we are producing our work, but we need to find a place and a platform where we can start. We have technology at our disposals that we need to be using. We need to use podcasts. We need to write our blogs in our indigenous languages and tap into platforms such as the university spaces to support us. Because if we do not tap into that, we will not have the support that we need. So we need to use platforms that are already existing in order for us to be connected to each other. And I think that goes with, artists, working and doing the work without being restricted to, if they can articulate, but just the fact that we are just starting, because we need to start somewhere.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Kahas, on that. Very, very important, especially what you bring about in terms of content creation, that we cannot stress too much or only about, developing the text or drawing from a specific resource, but just finding content in our daily lived experiences, and especially drawing from your work, just creating our daily lived experiences and applying our languages to express and unpack and the contemporary issues that we are facing with today as well, on women, on children, on everyone. So a very big discussion. Obviously, it will take 365 days for us to cover everything. This was a starter, and thank you very much for our panelists for pushing as much as we can to express in the very limited time. We will briefly move over to the Q&A before we close our webinar for the evening. And the first question is to Ms. Naitsikire on the issue of distribution. And I think the issue of consumption with regards to the economy around which text is produced or published and which is not. The question reads, and it is from Herbert Vantana. Will the lack of distribution discourage UNAM Press to continue publishing these types of books? And does UNAM Press initiate translation of an educational book with permission from the author? The second question is, which local language, apart from English, is the best-selling publication at UNAM Press? I can read this again. 2 questions to Ms. Naitikire. Number 1, will the lack of distribution discourage UNAM Press to continue publishing these types of books? And does UNAM Press initiate translation of an educational book with permission from the author? Second question, which local language, apart from English, is the best-selling publication at UNAM Press? From Herbert Vantana.
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Vantanar. I can definitely say that absolutely not. The lack of distribution into rural communities will not discourage UNAM Press from publishing indigenous language books. We very much welcome manuscripts written in indigenous languages. Authors do need to keep in mind that UNAM Press is an academic publisher, so we do have international guidelines, publishing guidelines that we adhere to and that we maintain in order to make sure that all our publications, whether in English or in an indigenous language, are of high quality and that they can sit on a bookshelf next to publications from across the world. So we will not be discouraged from publishing these indigenous language publications. There was something about initiating translation of educational material. We don't initiate translation of books. I mean, translation is a costly, it's a costly exercise to endeavor into. We have received offers from individuals who want to translate books, but these books still need to fall within the publishing program of the university. As yet, we have not received, we have not initiated translation of educational books. And I assume you mean educational books that are in indigenous languages. or into indigenous languages. The second question was which local language local language book apart from English is the best selling at the university? I believe this would be the book written in 2017 by Dr. Hangara. It was showed up on the screen. It's called Otudo Tobaherero. It's a book on the Ocheherero Petri clans. And this book has done significantly well because, number one, the author himself has taken time to market this book within the regions where it is relevant, where the language is spoken. So he's gone out into the communities and spoken to the communities and marketed and sold his books within the communities. And secondly, the book has been prescribed as additional reading for the Ocheherero language in the schools. So it's currently in the schools. And for those two reasons, it's done incredibly well.
Thank you very much for that answer. There is another question from Mr. Herbert Vantena still, and I'd like to direct this question to Dr. Nicholas Fredericks, especially with regards to your work, Doctor. You have in your various publications, you have spoken about the issue of the national policy in terms of developing languages and the challenges in the pragmatics around the policy. And you have also expressed how schools are a very viable space in producing speakers and also writers of indigenous languages. There's a question here that I'd like to direct to you. It says, don't you think we should use local language plays in theater as a tool to connect cultures by means of education performances so we can learn each other's languages on a social platform? I will repeat. Don't you think we should use local language plays in theater as a tool to connect cultures by means of education performances so we can learn each other's languages on a social platform? Just to extend on this, Dr. Fredericks, because you also do speak about schools being viable spaces. Do you see performance spaces being as viable as schools are, as valuable, as enabling, as constructive, and for especially early childhood development in learning language? Please, Doctor.
Oh, thank you very much, Delago. Just to start with the first question, I mean, if local languages, I hope I am audible. If local languages can be used to actually, transmit, one's culture to the other and so on, so that one can learn each other's cultures and so on. The good thing with African languages is that, you would realize that most of these languages, or what we actually perceive as languages, are dialects. So most of the times we would realize that as much as we think these are languages, here and there you are already following. I've realized this with my work in the Khoisan languages, for example, whereby you have got the Khoi group, for example, and then you have got the San group. The San languages, here and there, they understand each other. And then you have got the Bantu languages. It is proven, by literature that, you would actually at least hear something, even though you don't understand everything. Here and there, when someone speaks, a language that is close to you, in terms of the linguistic family, then definitely, you would be able to follow. So coming back to the issue around whether a theater, can be used as a environment or a space where one can learn language. To come with, schools are actually limited. When it comes to the theater, I am convinced that it can do better because we have got the audiences, young and old. And in most cases, I have seen in revitalization work all over the world that they use things like the language nest, whereby people would convene at a particular space and then they would communicate or use a particular language in order to keep the culture going. So the theater can play that role in Namibia, whereby the languages that we are losing, we can easily go back to the theater, and this could be the place where one can learn the language. So the contemporary in the contemporary space, what we are faced with is people teaching their kids, colonial languages and so on. So our languages, the indigenous language.
Sorry, Doctor, you are on mute.
Oh, sorry. Oh, okay. So let me just repeat quickly. So what I was saying is that the theater space can actually be the space that can actually enhance the use of local languages or the indigenous languages, and it's actually a space that is better than the schools, because schools are limited to learners and so on. With this space, we can bring in learners and even the elderly. So that's why I'm convinced that the theater can actually play that particular role. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fredericks. Very, very a good point brought about there, because we can think of theater not only for leisure purposes, not only for entertainment, not only to unpack very hectic conversations, or not only for memorization, but it's also for education. And if we are to think about early childhood development, theater definitely has a space there. And in terms of sectoral engagements, collaborating across various sectors and across various institutions, that is how theater practices can also grow sustainably as well. Thank you for that. The next question is I will direct to Professor Krishnamurthy. It is from Agustinus Ngombe. The question reads, since research is a costly exercise and many people who know the language elements are in villages, how can we ensure that funding is sourced to enable the writers to conduct research in any sort? I'll read this again. Since research is a costly exercise, how many people who know the language elements are in the villages? How can we ensure that funding is sourced to enable the writers to conduct research in any sort? Perhaps you can extend a bit on the project that you are also working on, Professor. You are on mute.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Nilau. I think, this is where, the academic community has to come in, because we have access, yes, research is very expensive, and we have access to funds because there are a lot of funds that are available. But we have to apply, you have to write the proposals, they have to be well written, and it is quite a competition to get the funding. But once you get the funding, then it is possible for the researchers to go into the community. I think this is where, at NUST we have these three pillars, and we talk about teaching and learning, we talk about research, and we also talk about community engagement. So I would imagine that community engagement is a very important pillar for our institution, and I think that's the case with any educational institution, because we are not like Oxford and Cambridge, ivory towers where we sit in our room and we do our research. We have to go out into the community, we have to reach out into the community, and for me, I think there is a wealth of knowledge in the community that needs to be tapped and that needs to be preserved. And of course, the advantage that we have is because we have got students, and these students speak those languages. We can use the students to go into the communities. But for me, it's not enough to use the students to go into the communities. I think it is to train them so that they become, now I want my students to do their masters. I want them to do their PhDs, because I always tell my students that, look, I want to be made redundant at a certain point in time. I want to produce 10 PhDs who will take over my job. So that is what we have to do. That's how we progress. And as I said, the problem is because there is so much of privilege that is attached to English and to the European languages, that most people want to think of doing research in that area. But no, we have to go back into our own communities. And so this is what I would plead for. I'm going to tell Dr. Fredericks that he must introduce, he's working on masters and recurriculation of applied linguistics. Maybe you need to introduce indigenous languages in applied linguistics, so that you can get masters and PhD students who will go back and do research in those areas.
Thank you, Professor. The next question is directed to Ms. Class. It is from Lalu Mokuku, who is actually joining us from Makanda. Greetings, Lalu. She is responding to your comment about translanguaging. And she says, yes, Florence, what would the role of translanguaging be? You did briefly speak about this, but if you would like to expand. She continues to write, especially when you talk about young people, perhaps not for, but with, how could it look like? So I'll read the question again. Yes, Florence, what would the role of translanguaging be? Especially when you talk about young people, perhaps not for, but with, how could it look like?
Okay, so it's a collective effort. How when we as young people work together with our parents and our grandparents and our community leaders, we start the process of having conversations. I think we need to start there. We need to start there to have critical conversations about our mother tongues. We need to create those safe spaces where we talk about where are we at? Where are we at as Namibians when it comes to our mother tongues? We need to have that important conversations with each other. And I think out of that conversation, we will find a lot of depth of information and knowledge will come out of that, and which knowledge will also inspire us in terms of the way we are documenting our languages, but we are also promoting that so that we can build a much more broader movement in terms of archiving our work and in terms of ensuring that our languages continues to grow from where it is right now. So we need to start to have that conversation with each other. And another thing is we need to share the work that we are doing, because it should be a process of intergenerational learning processes as well, whereby we are using what the raw materials that we have created.
I think we are losing her, but she will be back with us again. And I understand that Dr. Nicholas Fredericks wants to add on the issue of translanguaging. Please, Doctor, before we get back to Ms. Trajas.
Oh, thank you very much, Nelago.
Yes.
All right, great. No, I just wanted to add on the issue of translanguaging, because when it comes to the youth, you know, they have got the hybrid form of language. So they are the ones, I mean, we will be talking about one language only as a bounded entity. I mean, this language, we can't penetrate it and so on. But the youth would actually come whereby they would use English with Kwekukobab, English with any other language, or 4 or 5 languages, you know, so they would come up with these hybrid forms. And this is where the issue of translanguaging actually comes. And in most instances, I mean, we don't even know that we are doing it. And I've seen, I mean, you know, lately there is actually, I mean, in popular cultures, hip hop music, whereby you would find English and Kwekukobab competing for space. You know, so this is where the youth actually comes in, whereby one can easily say, no, our languages are not actually backward as we think. In fact, they are actually, I mean, they can utilize a space alongside any other language. So this is where the issue around translanguaging in the hybrid forms actually comes in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doctor. I would like for Ms. Trajas to actually complete her comment. I think she is trying to get back to us. But what I do appreciate is her bringing up the issue of safe spaces. And I think particularly for institutions, this is the role that we get to play as well, especially if we are contextualizing the safe spaces, particularly for young people, and safe spaces in which this appetite for ourselves can be generated. Safe spaces in which we can motivate, you know, the application of our languages, the production of our aesthetics, the production of our techniques. And I think this is very, very important for institutions, for schools, for theaters, for the directorates of arts and culture, in really ensuring safe spaces that ensure this constructive, slow process of engagement, and perhaps not always focusing on projects and producing works. And there are times we need to breathe and also consider safe spaces and enabling that as well. I hope Ms. Tajas will be joining us soon. We will be ending our webinar soon. I'll just like to also share some comments that our audiences have shared before we close off. There is a comment from Trixie Munyama. She says the lack of indigenous languages in performance spaces equally stems from the colonial history of theater making and performance. Certainly. There is another comment from Dr. Lorenda Olivier-Sampson. She says it is not easy. I think she's speaking about the consumption, the idea, the conversation about the consumption of theater. Besides the competition from everything that young people can find on their phones to consuming indigenous products, I have a feeling that the culture of reading is waning. Another factor was mentioned by Irene Garoes, that many Namibian young parents are speaking English to their children. It is one of the greatest treasures that we can give to our children is fluency in as many languages as possible. That is from Dr. Lorenda Olivier-Sampson. There's another comment from Irene, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Irene Garoes. Professor is right. Let's first promote and then we think of money. The state needs a free publishing house. This was commenting on Professor's remarks about perhaps we don't have to create works to sell, but we need to create works to consume for ourselves as well, because it's constructive in that manner. There is another comment from Nashilongwe Shipe Mushanja, He says that I am chewing on the idea of indigenous language beyond the spoken and the written. Indigenous language as in arts and artifacts, dance, ritual, landscapes, etc. That is from Nashilongwe Shipe Mushanja. And there's another comment from Samson Hangula who says we need to promote our vernacular through social media and on Google platform. Wow, that is a conversation that we definitely need to have perhaps with our IT constructors and service solution service providers as well. There's another comment from Lalu from Makanda. She says, so at the National Arts Festival, that is Makanda, South Africa, please come and visit and experience Dipalo as we endeavor to explore trans-languaging. The festival ends on 31st July. You are all welcome. Thank you so much for today. It's virtual and there are many more comments. And thank you to everyone that has been engaging on our Zoom platform, on our chat, engaging with each other. Thank you to everyone that has joined us on YouTube. It is unfortunate that Ms. Tajas can't join us. I think she's having internet trouble. But in this regard, I would like to very much thank our panelists for joining us today, for preparing for today. There's only so much you can say. I am sure that you had so much more to express and to unpack and to share. But thank you very much for this time. And we hope to share your work and your contacts with very much interested researchers and artists as well. And we hope that the conversation does not end here. Thank you very much for all that you have instigated, for all that you have enlightened and lit within our audiences and lit within our theater as well. Thank you very much. With that said, I would like to also thank our audiences for joining us and to wish you all a very good evening. And until next time, see you at the theater, either on stage or virtually, and take care.
Thank you very much. This was excellent. I had a very pleasant
evening. Thank you for hosting us, Nilabo. Thank you very much.
Everyone. Thank you. Thank you for organizing this.
Thank you for the platform, Nirago. Thank you to the National Theatre for this wonderful platform.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Thank you.
Do a young as a goma to be the go. Bosuere somewhere and cook, but we get do a young as a goma to be